we have a talk called Disability is the Canary in the Coal Mine. Disability is seen as a niche issue in the newsroom, despite disabled people making up 26% of the working age population in America and the largest minority in the world. No matter the beat, disabled people are always the most affected by failures in the system, and they are the least reported on. So we have with us Kara Reedy. Kara is the founder and director of the Disabled Journalists Association. She's a journalist who spent 10 years at CNN producing documentaries as well and writing for different verticals. And in 2019, she produced a doc for The Guardian entitled Dwarfism and Me, an exploration of the treatment of dwarfs in American society. And she spent the last 3 years studying disability and its coverage in the media. And we also have Jen Deerenwater. Jen Deerenwater is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers a myriad of issues here, that's HIR, pronounced here, communities face with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and a 2019 New Economies Reporting Project and a 2020 Disability Futures Fellow. So I will turn this over to Kara and Jen. Thank you both so much.
Disability is the canary in the coal mine. What I mean by that is often when you hear disability spoken about, you'll say, oh yes, and also the disabled people, like we're a separate group of people. Guess what? We also have race. But here, so actually the old number in my bio was 26%. I just went back to the CDC, it's moved up. We're now 27% of the population. Still over a quarter of the adult population of the United States. That's the largest minority, like it just is. And yet, how often do you hear reports about disability? Not inspirational porn, weird stuff about, look at Timmy and his walker. Isn't this great that a science class built a walker for Timmy? And it's like, okay, well, why is a science class building a walker for Timmy? Why can't Timmy afford a walker? So, rates of disability by race in adults. Native Americans are the top. You're the top, man. 13.7%. Black Americans, we come in right behind at 12.9%. White Americans at 10.7%, and Latinos 8.1%, and Asian population is 4.2%. But do have to remember, wherever you are, the numbers will fluctuate. So places like New York City, where there's high poverty rates in Asian populations, those numbers will go up. So disability rates among children, guess what? Native Americans still at the top. Children of more than one race and black children, statistically, it's the same amount, 5.1 and 5.2%. Non-Hispanic white children come in at 4.3%, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, 3.2%, and then other Asian, which this is not how I group people, this is how I got the data from the census, is 2.3%. If you broke it down probably by different Asian ethnicities, it would fluctuate. Disability and poverty. So, of the 79.6 million family households in the United States, a quarter included at least one family member with a disability. Now look at the rates of poverty in those families. 11.4% of families who have family members who are disabled live in poverty. 20.2% of those families with a disabled child, so the numbers go up with a disabled child, live in poverty. 9.7% with a disabled adult, and then 29.9% with both a disabled child and an adult. That's 30% of the population in the United States of families. So I always hear people saying, why do we have such a chronically unhoused population? And then I never hear the word disability. Never. Guess what? During the pandemic, the levels of chronically unhoused disabled people increased by 16%. Since 2016, that population has been steadily rising. So when people, like I've had friends in LA be like, oh my God, there's so many unhoused people. What's the deal? And I'm like, did you ever think that most of them were disabled? And then they look at me like, oh. And what is that? So Canary in the coal mine, the whole theory behind that, right? Is so any system that you're looking at in the world that's broken, if you study disabled people, you will find the breaks in the system. If you ignore disabled people, you're never going to solve it. So the disability tax, have you ever heard of a disability tax? Just by being disabled, your life becomes more expensive. So disabled people have to make 28% more income or an additional $17,690 a year to obtain the same standard of living as a similar household with a member with a disability. Employment rates, but then let's talk about employment. So unemployment rates, disabled people always have double. It's always double the number. Whatever people without a disability have, you just usually double the number. So it's 7.6% of people with a disability are unemployed compared to 3.5% of non-disabled people. In 2022, 30% of workers with a disability were employed part-time. Now, here's the thing with that. Some disabled people can only work part-time. Physically, that's all they can do. That doesn't mean they should be living in poverty. So when we're reporting on things like Build Back Better, and all I ever hear about Build Back Better that failed and didn't pass, we're always talking about the families and the caregiving. But we never talk about disabled people or the disabled people living in those families and what that does if they can't afford a caregiver, right? So, employed persons with a disability were more likely to be self-employed. I can answer that for myself. Why? Rampant discrimination, rampant ableism. Like, I didn't even need a statistic on that. That's just my life. So let's talk about incarceration. Let's start with the kids. So black students account for 15.5% of all public school students, but are 39% of students suspended from school, an overrepresentation of about 23%. Just the whole disabled students account for 12% of public school students, but were 20% more likely to be suspended. They made up 25% of the out-of-school suspension. Let's talk about disabled black students. They account for 19% of all K through 12 disabled students, but are nearly 36% of students with disabilities suspended from school, an overrepresentation of 17%. So when you talk about school to prison pipeline and you don't mention disability, what are you doing? Mass incarceration, again, talk about mass incarceration and you don't mention disability. 24% of all prisoners reported participating in special ed classes, a quarter. 29% of federal prisoners are disabled, 40% of state prisoners. 13.7% of federal prisoners have a cognitive disability. A cognitive disability is defined as having trouble remembering things. 24% of state inmates have a cognitive disability. And when you think about that, when I've brought this up in newsrooms before, they're like, oh, are disabled people more criminal? I'm like, no, the police are targeting them. Like, they're targeting them. When you think of the big names of people that have been killed by cops, most of them are disabled. Elijah McClain, Sandra Bland. Yep. So I just ran through this really quickly so you guys could have like a bit of a snapshot of what was happening. That's the end of my slideshow. And Jen and I are going to talk. We're going to have a little conversation about disability coverage and being have multiple identities and what that looks like. So my first question to you, Jen, is I personally believe that identity affects how someone approaches reporting. Your identity as a Native American person who also is part of the queer community, I'm sure changes your way of covering. What frustrates you the most about the way your communities are covered?
So I've been thinking on this question, and I'm like, how do I give a concise answer where I'm not just screaming up here? I think the big thing is that I don't often see my communities covered. You know, outside of Native press, who reports on Native people? And when they do, how do they do it? You know, like there was an urban MMIW, which stands for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, because we do have very high rates of our women and girls and children being stolen from our communities. So there was this urban report about it. And one of the things they talked about was how when non-Native press would report on MMIW issues, they would often talk about how the women had drug addiction or alcoholism, or they were sex workers. You know, like one, that's apparently what all we Natives are. And two, even if you are that person, like you somehow deserved what happened to you, you know? I feel like also just as a Native person, a disabled person, there's just no understanding of us. There's none. Like, you know, I do reporting. I'm a freelancer with Truth Out, but then I also run this nonprofit, Crushing Colonialism. So I'm on both sides of the interview. And a few years back, I was doing an interview with someone, and I told them, you have to cite me as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. If you don't do that, you've not cited me properly. Article came out, they just listed me as Cherokee. And I was like, do you not get there are 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes and that we're all different? So you just botched that. You know, so I feel like there's no understanding of my communities, and I don't see a lot of people outside of them doing the work to learn. And then in terms of disability, like, where do I even start with that?
I know.
You know, I will say, the data that you gave, there's actually a statistic by the National Congress of American Indians, which is our oldest, longest running Native organization in the so-called US, where they actually say 24% of American Indian and Alaskan Natives are disabled. You know, I do a lot of research around in reporting and things on climate, for example, and I try to do that in a very intersectional way, looking at how like BIPOC folks are more impacted and rural and, you know, and so forth. And so I did 2 different pieces in, I think it was 2021, about indigeneity, disability, and climate. And I showed how anywhere I could find data on indigeneity and disability, Indigenous people had the highest rates per capita of disabilities. But when you start looking at other issues like police brutality, incarceration, you know, environmental degradation, all of these things, it's like, well, the system is making us disabled. And then it keeps us disabled by denying us health care, by keeping us impoverished. I myself am on SSDI. You know, I work, but also with my disabilities, I couldn't hold a permanent job down. Like, that's just not a possible thing for me. As well as I just don't have the patience for people and their nonsense anymore. Like, I'm over 40 now, and excuse my language, but I just don't give any fucks anymore. So I prefer to just be on my own working for myself. But, you know, fellowships and writing and journalism contests and things, like, I feel so locked out of it because they won't work with me to pay me out, generally won't work with me, to pay me out in a way that doesn't impact my benefits. Like, you may have $10,000 for me, but that's not going to do much for me if I lose my health insurance, you know? So I feel like the issues aren't covered, and like, journalist communities just aren't there and aren't getting it. You know, I get frustrated with journalistic affinity groups who, you know, I'm supposed to feel welcome here as a Native, but then you didn't make the place accessible for me as a disabled person, so I still can't be here. You know, the problems with funding, you know, as a freelancer, I'm always like, how do I come up with money to fund my work? Because I really enjoy investigative reporting, and, you know, that's expensive. And it's frustrating, all the hoops I have to jump through with grants and foundations and things. And, you know, it's like, man, I am in severe pain, have horrible fatigue. I just want to do the job. I don't want to have to deal with all of these nonsense, things. And like, I also want to say wado, thank you to Crystal and everyone who planned this, because one, organizing something like this is a lot of work, but two, they really worked with me to make this as accessible for me as possible. It's hard for me with the pain and the health issues I have to just get out of bed, let alone come to something like this and meaningfully participate. And if it's not made accessible, I'm just not going to come. I feel like if I show up and there are stairs to get in, you've already told me that you didn't think about me and I wasn't welcome, And those are problems we have within all of the journalistic community. I mean, I could keep going on, but I'm going to stop.
No, it's true. We've talked about this before about the other affinity groups not making things accessible. So, what is the figure I just put up? The 12.9% of African Americans or Black Americans are disabled. I went to NABJ and I went to my panel and then did not go again because it was so big. There was no way to get around. And I was like, I don't think you really want me here. Not only that, when I have gone to NABJ events before and they were accessible, when I talked about things like I'm struggling to find work, I'm being discriminated against, I've been told you're not hustling enough. And so I think there's a lot of conversation that we need to have as a journalistic group, that if you're saying these things to people, then you can't possibly be covering disabled people properly. You have to investigate. Here's the thing. Everybody in this room is an ableist. Everyone. You and I are. We're all ableist. We were raised in it, and it's a murky soup of ableism. The thing you have to say to yourself is question yourself every time. Is this ableist? Have I thought about other people? When someone says I can't access that, do I say, I'm sorry about that? Oh, well. Or do I think, let me work it out. Let me figure it out. So that brings me to my next question. So you're starting Crushing Colonialism. I mean, you've started it. But what are the ways that you are working with Crushing Colonialism to change the environment in journalism, but also in just culture?
So we have three main programming areas, and I think the two that are probably the most relevant for today are our Hire Indigenous initiative. We're fully launching that next fall, but it's looking at getting Indigenous people in media and storytelling roles. And not just okay, we got you a job at, say, I don't know, the Washington Post or something, but getting people funding, getting them trained, and supporting them through it all. It's traumatic reporting on some of the community issues that we report on. How do we support each other and give that space, So those are things that we're working on. We want to work with funders and employers to try to get them to meet Indigenous community where we're at, as opposed to expecting us to meet this standard that we've purposefully been kept from being able to meet, But we are also launching a quarterly publication in December. And so we're just calling it Crushing Colonialism, the magazine. And we're doing two versions of this. And the reason for this is that we work with Indigenous people across borders, across oceans. So we all speak different languages. We're all coming from different places. We know the digital divide is very pervasive for Indigenous community, as well as Black and Brown communities as well. If either you just don't have telecommunications infrastructure, or maybe you have it, but you can't afford the internet and you can't afford the gadgets for it, So we're making a hard copy version that we're going to distribute for free to Indigenous tribes and led organizations and individuals who request it. And then we're doing a nice, sleek, online, digital magazine where we'll have written and photographic content, but we'll also have audio and video. We're doing a Spanish and an English version. We're working with a language justice consultant, as well as disability justice consultants. We're relaunching our whole website in November to support all of this work. And so for me, it was how one, I always ask myself the question, who did I leave out of this room? Because if I'm leaving people out, the work is not complete. And I think there's always spaces for us to learn and grow and unlearn all the hundreds of years of trash that's been browbeaten into us. Like we all have a lot of work to do on that. So with the magazine, I was like, how do we make this accessible both for content creators and users? So ideas that we've had is like maybe we ask someone to do a report in sign language. That opens up a whole new space for content creators and consumers to see themselves and to be embraced and to have a place to share their stories. Like we're going to have a section that's for community members to just tell us a little bit about what's happening in their lands, And if this grows and we get the funding, and if you have money, please come talk to me. We've even talked about, like, if the community wants it, we would do it in Brazilian, Portuguese, and French. So we're really trying to make everything we do as accessible for people as possible and giving good entry points for people that are like, oh, I want to do media work, but I don't have a clue where to start. Like, I didn't go to college. I didn't go to J school. What do I do? So that's a little bit about what we're up to.
I think accessibility is like the new frontier, and so much of what happens in accessibility spaces right now when large publications are like, we're going to make it accessible, and then they're like, we're going to put the least amount of money into it and figure out like what we can get the most bang for our buck, rather than like actually making it accessible. And the thing that people don't really understand about accessibility too is if you make it accessible, it's accessible for everyone. You have opened up your audience share to everyone, which means more money. And like, I'm not a capitalist, but this country is. And if you're talking about cash, don't you want their money? Like, there's like $1 billion that's left on the table of disabled people's money. And when I was in newsrooms, I would say that, and they'd be like, I don't want that money. Oh, you don't want that money? That money's tainted? Like, what?
Yeah, like you're going to catch our disability by taking a dollar bill from us,
Like, none of it makes sense. And also the other thing is everyone in this room is going to be disabled. If you make it to elderly status, God willing, you are going to be disabled. A lot of times when I put up that number, 27%, people will be like, but does that include old people? Like, that matters? And I'm like, yes. Oh, okay. Like you don't care about them. Like, they're not supposed to go outside. Like, or they're not supposed to cross the street or get a curb cut or like anything. And I think there's a lot of like conversations that we have to have about enveloping people and like being open to it. You talked a lot about like funding and stuff, and I think what a lot of people don't realize, what is the number? It's like 0.03% of philanthropy dollars.
We're talking for Native folks, I don't even know what it is. It's less than 0.5% goes to Native organizations. And something that I am seeing is that some of the foundations that are supporting Native-led orgs, they're kind of just giving all the money to one or two, and then expecting all of us in Indian country to fight it out for that money. And unfortunately, it also means that you put a lot of power sometimes into the hands of bad actors, and that's a problem.